It's quite possible that Hitler's prolonged use of methamphetamines heightened his mental instability. Consequently, over time he became less and less likely to listen to the advice given to him by subordinates. His outbursts of violent rage also became more frequent. Churchill and JFK's struggles with mental health benefited the world, but mania in a leader can also lead to disaster. In 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain stood before the House of Commons to make an announcement. He would travel to Germany to meet Hitler in an attempt to convince him of the unnecessariness of war. MPs jumped up and cheered at the plan. But Winston Churchill remained seated, despite others rebuking him for not joining in. Churchill had his reasons. In 1930, long before anyone else in British government came to the same conclusion, Churchill had recognized the Nazis' threat. They were a danger to world peace. In the author's professional opinion, Churchill likely had type 2 bipolar disorder. This resulted in several manic and depressive phases. Therefore, in the author's eyes, Churchill's depressive experience meant he was able to discern situations realistically. In comparison, his mentally healthy colleague's optimism was misplaced. The 35th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, is also an interesting figure. For the author, JFK exemplifies hyperthymic personality disorder. Simply put then, he was a hyperactive and creative risk-taker, with a sex drive to match. This was particularly in evidence during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. The Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev sent Russian nuclear missiles to Cuba to goad Kennedy into a preemptive strike with atomic weapons. But Kennedy held firm. He ignored the advice of everyone around him. By doing so, he averted nuclear disaster. Other leaders who might not have had Kennedy's experience with mental health struggles would probably have acted differently. No doubt they would have shared the natural impulse common among Kennedy's advisors and ordered a preemptive attack. Adolf Hitler is another world leader worth considering when thinking about mental health. The author is certain that Hitler had bipolar disorder. But what really caused the evils he leveled on the world was his vile ideology mixed with an over-reliance on methamphetamines. Certainly, Hitler suffered from bouts of mania and depression during his childhood. It's thanks to his friend August Kubizek that we know this. Hitler had always had an aggressively megalomaniacal streak, but it was as a leader capable of manipulating the masses that he found his feet. The author even argues that his demagoguery might have been facilitated by his personality disorder. It's also worth remembering that Hitler's aggressive and maniacal behavior went into overdrive from 1937 onward. That's when his doctor started prescribing him methamphetamines. It's quite possible that Hitler's prolonged use of methamphetamines heightened his mental instability. Consequently, over time he became less and less likely to listen to the advice given to him by subordinates. His outbursts of violent rage also became more frequent. Tony Blair and George W. Bush's sound mental health did not help them lead. It's fairly common for journalists and political commentators to start blaming politicians' mental health when they don't like their decisions and actions. That was very much the case with 43rd U.S. President George W. Bush and Tony Blair, the UK Prime Minister from 1997 to 2007. Many people thought that their political decisions were indicative of mental instability. But as far as the author is concerned, their thought processes were fairly typical for mentally healthy minds. After September 11th, both leaders felt their countries were threatened. They wanted to act. It's now clear that this impulse led them to invade Iraq on evidence that later proved extremely dubious. Let's run a thought experiment here. What if these leaders had either hyperthymia or bipolar personalities? Both of these disorders are closely associated with higher creativity. Therefore, we may speculate that such leaders would have been able to see the unfolding situation from multiple perspectives. Such a leader might well have realized that the evidence was too insubstantial to support an invasion. He would have found another way forward, probably one inconceivable to less creative, mentally healthy types. Just think of Kennedy's response during the Cuban Missile Crisis for a comparison. Bush and Blair's next move was also typical for the mentally healthy. Once their decision had been made, they found themselves unable to change course. They were simply unwilling to see that their assessment of the situation in Iraq had been wrong and that the evidence on which they based their arguments for invasion was insubstantial. Even once it was clear that they hadn't been successful, they refused to budge. The author is therefore of the opinion that Bush and Blair chose to keep troops in Iraq instead of acknowledging their mistakes. Such stubbornness is typical of those who are mentally healthy. So Bush and Blair were hardly exceptional. Characteristically, most people just don't like admitting they have ever been wrong. This thought experiment just goes to show that had the United Kingdom and the United States had leaders with more experience of mental illness, then the whole world might ultimately have benefited. In a hypothetical world, had Kennedy been president after September 11, there would have been no Iraq invasion. Or, had there been an invasion, troops wouldn't have been stationed there long once it was clear an error had been made. Recognizing the relative benefits of mental illness will aid in destigmatizing it. Despite the author's sympathetic portrayal of mental illness, the fact remains that mental illness remains a taboo subject. There's clear evidence that we, as a society, are scared of mental illness. A 2004 study published in the Psychiatric Bulletin showed that even medical professionals were prejudiced against people diagnosed with mental illnesses. This situation makes it incredibly difficult for someone faced with mental illness. It also makes it very tricky for non-sufferers to get a clear perspective on it. Specifically, the continuing stigma surrounding mental illness means we're unable to see its upsides. The first thing we could do is simply acknowledge and accept that past world leaders weren't always mentally healthy. That doesn't mean we have to rewrite history. It's just another layer of knowledge contributing to our picture of the past. Mentally ill people have contributed to make the world a better place. The examples we've looked at in these blinks barely scratch the surface. The author has also analyzed other renowned figures. For instance, Ted Turner, a pioneer of 24-hour cable news and the founder of CNN, experienced mental illness, as did President Abraham Lincoln. Turner displayed a hyperthymic personality type, while Lincoln was dysthymic. We should accept, then, that mental health isn't just a question of abnormal types contrasted with seemingly normative behavior. That approach is typical of people who consider themselves mentally fit and distance themselves from anything that is marked as different. Once we've accepted that beloved historical figures were mentally unwell and started destigmatizing mental health, we can move on to the next step. In this changed atmosphere, more people will doubtless seek diagnosis and help. No longer will diagnosis be something to be ashamed of, but rather something with appreciable qualities. That analysis seemed true to the author as he wrote this book during the presidency of the 44th U.S. President, No Drama Obama, as he is often known. At the time, an ideal president seemed to be someone who was balanced and middle of the road, psychologically as well as politically. For the author, here's where the rub lies. That sort of president might be effective in peaceful times, but what kind of leader is needed when times are rockier? To his mind, what's needed is someone who can think differently, someone who's an asset because of the mental health issues he's experienced. Think of Churchill in World War II or JFK in the teeth of the Cold War, the leaders you need in times of crisis. Mental illness is not something of which to be ashamed. Although it's true that living with a mental illness can be difficult, exhausting and upsetting for those affected and their loved ones, there is an upside. History shows us that some of the greatest world leaders were effective and unique because of their histories of mental health issues. It was precisely what was wrong with them that made them successful.